And starting broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Apologies, we were having a little bit of technical difficulties, but this is Sue Tensfeld here, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Knowledge Transfer, a toolkit that can work for water and wastewater utilities, sponsored by Baywork. Baywork is a consortium of Bay Area water and wastewater utilities working together to ensure that we will have the reliable workforce needed to serve our customers and protect the environment. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see a control panel in the upper right corner of your screen. You can hide the control panel at any time during the webinar by clicking on the orange arrow. The webinar will automatically default to using your computer speaker system. If you would prefer to join in over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. After logging on, your microphone will automatically be muted. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and try to address as many questions as we can during the short Q&A session in the middle of the presentation and the longer one at the end. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be viewable at baywork.org within the next 2 weeks. I would now like to introduce Robert Scott, the chair of the Baywork Staff Preparedness Subcommittee, who will be the moderator for today's webinar. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Sue, and good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you again to Baywork's webinar on knowledge transfer, and we want to apologize again for the technical difficulties that we experienced. We're so glad to have our presenter, Gabriel Lewald, with us today. Gabe is a senior learning and performance specialist with Sacramento Municipal Utility District, also known as SMUD. He has over 16 years of experience in the fields of corporate training and human resource management. Gabe was charged with leading a cross-functional initiative that resulted in deployment of toolkits for both workforce planning and knowledge capture at SMUD. He has a master's degree in human resource management and instructional design. And with any further ado, I will turn it over to Gabe Lewald.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you. And we'll talk a little bit about the SMUD process that we deployed. And we're happy to entertain questions along the way. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you here. Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody can see my little intro slide here. Okay, so I'm hoping you're seeing this knowledge capture at SMUD slide. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about, again, the process we developed here, and we'll pause a few times to answer questions. We also have some polling questions planned, so we hope to have some interaction along the way as well. So with that, just a little bit of background about SMUD. So we're the nation's 6th largest community-owned electric provider. And we have about half our power today coming from non-carbon sources. We have a good reputation in terms of customer service, and we have about 2,000 employees serving about 1.5 million residents in our service territory. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. So why don't we start with a couple of questions here. Robert, can we go to our first couple of polling questions?
Sure. Here's the first question. Does your organization have a formal knowledge capture transfer process in place today? Please type in your answers, and that is yes, no, or not sure. Does your organization have a formal knowledge capture transfer process in place today? We see answers coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds here, one more time for people to give their responses. Okay, responses are still coming in. Okay, and I'll be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Poll is closed. Let me share the responses with you.
So it looks like we have about close to a third of folks saying yes, they do have a process in place today. little more than half indicating they don't yet have a process, and then interestingly, about almost 20% there, not sure. So that's good to know that there's also folks here with us today that already have processes deployed. So one of our goals with Baywork is to foster that sharing of best practices. So when we get into the Q&A session, if you have other comments or resources or tools to add, by all means, feel free to add that at that time. So that's great to see. Robert, can we go ahead and launch our second poll question?
Sure. Second question. How would you describe your organization's knowledge capture process? Is it level 1, no process in place yet, researching strategies? Or level 2, various processes in place with little consistency? Or level 3, uniform process in place, organization-wide? We see answers coming in now. How would you describe your organization's knowledge capture process? Is it level 1, level 2, or level 3? For those of you who have them. Good, we see a bunch of answers coming in, and I'm going to close the poll here in a few seconds. Give it a little bit more time for others to respond. And poll is closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll share the results with you.
Great. So it looks like we have about a quarter of folks that are at that level 1 where there's really no process in place, and yet they're doing the research, and our organization started off right there. We have about, looks like almost 3/4 of folks that have a variety of different things being used today, but just not much consistency, and then a pretty small percentage that today have a uniform process. So we started off at SMUD, absolutely a level 1, really no process in place. We did a lot of research. I'll talk about that in a moment. And what we discovered during our research phase, we did an internal study to look at what was happening across the organization, and we found, depending on the department or the business unit, anywhere from absolutely nothing being done to capture tacit knowledge, all the way to some interesting internal best practices that we ended up folding into our toolkit we deployed. So we'll talk about more of those details in just a bit. Great. So let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint, Robert. Okay, great. Thanks for your help with that.
No
All
problem.
right, so we're going to go ahead and continue forward. So plenty of challenges for us. I'm sure like many of the other companies on the line with us today, we have a lot of icebergs out there. These are individuals with tons of institutional expertise, tacit knowledge that sits well below the waterline. So day to day, we might have very little idea just how much expertise resides between that person's ears, and yet we know it's a huge risk to the organization that we could actually sink as an organization if we lost some of that tacit knowledge. So that was really our goal, was to try to lower the waterline and expose more of that expertise that certainly hadn't been documented, they hadn't been interviewed. Instead, they were just walking out the door, and that caused a real challenge for us in terms of having to relearn and retrain and sometimes repeat mistakes that didn't have to be repeated. So that was really our goal. Now, one innovative approach we thought about was the Star Trek approach. This is the Vulcan mind meld. We gave that a shot. That didn't go over so well. So we thought we should go a different route. So for us, certainly an aging workforce. You can see some of the statistics I'm putting up on the slide. I'm guessing many of your organizations are in a similar position where the higher you go in the organization, the greater the risk in terms of turnover with key expertise. This is some data that we extracted from our HR systems. And for us, really, we've developed at this point what we call a heat map, where we're mapping the years of service with the years of with age, and we're finding really critical individuals that are good targets for knowledge capture that way. Again, I suspect the statistics at other public municipal entities are very similar. So for us, leveraging this workforce data out of our HR information system, was a key element of that initial research effort, so that when we went to executives to make the pitch for a strong, consistent process, we were armed with good data to support that business case. So we, like many organizations, have repositories for explicit knowledge. We use SharePoint, which I'm sure many of your companies do as well. EDM is a document kind of scanning and storage document management system. So a lot of documents are in there if they're official records. We've got shared drives, process maps, and training materials. What we did not start off with was any real method of capturing that tacit knowledge. Again, lots of experts walking around with 20, 30, 35 years of experience, and yet no real way of capturing or documenting that. So we ended up deploying what we call our knowledge capture toolkit, and that was really an effort to get a bit more consistency in how we approach that. Back in 2009, I was tasked with pulling together a cross-functional team that would go from end to end in developing a process. Our first step is we did a combination of internal and external research to look at what's the current as-is state of our organization and what are some best practices outside of our organization, even inside. So we contracted with a consulting firm called CPS, and they helped us with that research effort. At the end of that, we had some ideas of what we might try. We knew there were lots of risk in the organization, and we went to executives to ask them to formally sponsor this effort. And we brought to them a process for knowledge capture, as well as an outline of the toolkit and some of the strategies that we had in mind for capturing tacit knowledge. Once we had secured their sponsorship for this effort, including some communication to their respective business units, we then went ahead with the company-wide rollout, knowing that support from the very top of the organization would be critical for success as this cascaded down. So here's the three-step process we developed. So step one, we have to look at, if there's 20, 30 people in a given work group, where do you start? So that's not an easy question to answer. So the very first step is to look at whose knowledge should we be trying to capture. We call that the assessing of knowledge loss risk. And that's essentially a prioritization tool to try to figure out, of those 20, 30 people in a given area, who would you want to focus on? And we'll talk more about the specifics of that in a moment. Second question up there is really, okay, for those key individuals that we know pose a risk to the organization if they leave with tacit knowledge, where do we begin in terms of thinking about what knowledge to capture? So this step two is really a prioritization tool to help us figure out, of all the stuff that person knows, whether it's processes or technical elements or programs they manage, projects they've run, what's most critical for us to capture with that specific individual? So again, the funnel gets a little bit narrower there when we apply that second tool in our toolkit. Then finally, we need to have a solid plan, a detailed plan of exactly who's going to do what to capture and retain that specific expertise. Could be a skill, could be a knowledge, could be something else that individual has to share. So we call that our knowledge retention plan. That gets documented and typically stored on the work group's shared drive and or their team SharePoint site. So that knowledge retention plan is really critical, so there's clarity not just for that individual subject matter expert or SME, but also for their boss and typically their boss's boss in terms of what we're doing about that particular knowledge loss risk. So at a very high level, those are the three steps in our process. And really we have two approaches that we've taken to this. Once it's rolled out, we have a top-down component where we sit down with the senior leaders in a given business unit. So these are leaders of other leaders, and typically their executive is in the room as well. And we have them go through step one of identifying in their work groups where should we start this process. Now, management-driven process, it isn't terribly lengthy. We can sit down and walk them through that step one in about 20 to 30 minutes. and leave with a list of names of individuals we need to follow up with. And the only risk to that is you are somewhat limited by their understanding of all the ins and outs and SMEs in their work groups, and some of their downlines are quite large. So in some of the larger areas, we would cascade this and have a second level meeting with the direct reports meeting the supervisors led by those managers. And we would go through that process again to validate and make sure we weren't missing anyone. That's a top-down process. The other element we have is employee-driven, where twice a year we're offering workshops. And those workshops we're really outlining, number one, the business case, what are the barriers, how do we match tactics to different knowledge types. We use a framework for that. And we actually walk people through the toolkit. And what's unique about the workshops is those are wide open. So you could be individual subject matter expert or SME in one corner of the organization that realizes, man, I've got all this stuff to share, but no one's asked me yet. You can sign up for the workshop as an individual contributor. It's open to people who interact with those SMEs in various corporate services functions. We have some groups that, for example, do labor planning, and they're often in a good position to help facilitate some of this. And we also have leaders attend who recognize, boy, this is a real challenge in my work group today. I've got 2, 3, 5 individuals that I know are going to be retiring, for example, and I just don't know where to begin. So these workshops are pretty fun and interesting in terms of gathering a real interesting cross-section or kind of a diagonal slice of the organization, and we walk them through the toolkit from beginning to end, and they leave with a draft knowledge retention plan. It's a half-a-day workshop, and we kind of collapse what would normally be a series of meetings into that workshop environment. And then we've got myself and a colleague kind of floating around offering some one-on-one assistance along the way. So again, usually we get a good mix between SMEs and leaders participating in those. So before we go into the details of the toolkit, I think this might be a good time for us to pause and see if there's any questions at this stage. Robert, any questions coming in up till this point?
Okay, let's see. Do we have any questions here? All right. I don't see any questions yet, but I'd like to ask you a question, Gabe, that maybe you mentioned tacit knowledge. You mind explaining that a little bit?
Sure. So tacit knowledge is, there we go. Tacit knowledge, there's really 2 types of knowledge. You have the explicit kind, which is visible, and then the tacit knowledge is all of that invisible expertise that has not yet been surfaced either through documentation or interviews or putting together training manuals or putting together standard operating procedures. So for most organizations, that's really the primary risk. It's not the stuff you know, it's that stuff that keeps you awake at night because you don't know what you don't know. So that's our definition of tacit knowledge.
Okay. If you're able to hear and not see the slides, we're recommending that you log off and log back on. We had one person who had to do that for some reason, and we apologize for that difficulty if you are experiencing it. Okay, Gabe.
Okay, all right, so it sounds like we don't have questions yet at this stage. You can use the little question box if you want to put a question out there. Okay, so we'll continue on then. So in terms of the details of the process that we rolled out, at the end of that research effort, we had some ideas of what we might try, but really no formal process built out yet. So I worked with that cross-functional team, which included representatives from our group, which is organization workforce development. We did a combination of organization development and corporate learning and training, and as well as HR and a couple of other groups to provide input.
Hey, so, Gabe, excuse me,
yes,
Gabe. I just found some questions here, a few questions.
Okay.
Why don't we back up and answer a couple here?
Sure, okay.
All right. Someone asked, says, how did you obtain executive support for this enterprise-wide program? Did your CEO or president need to endorse it?
So that was critical. We saw that as a prerequisite for success. So early on, we were keeping our immediate executive apprised. We have a chief workforce officer that our group reports up to. So my boss and boss's boss and our executive were involved from early on in terms of making sure that we had this individual support, and they were very enthusiastically supportive. So there was some early, I'd say, informal socialization of this effort to gather some support. We then brought a pitch, if you will, to senior executives. So that was the entire executive committee. And there we, in advance, shared the research outcomes. So that was a very detailed report that consulting firm produced, just as background information. And we told them that at that meeting we'd be asking for their formal endorsement, which would look like formal communications to their downline saying, hey folks, this is coming. We'd like your full participation and cooperation when these folks meet with you to identify those at-risk positions. And that was important that communication came from the executives in each area. So fortunately, we were able to gain that endorsement early on in the process, and I really think that was essential for this to work, since inevitably our experience is that knowledge capture is one of those things that if you ask people, is it important? Most people are going to say, oh, of course it is. And then when you look at trying to make it a priority in light of all the other competing priorities they're facing, especially operationally if they're in a group that's supporting day-to-day operations, you have this tension between those priorities and this longer range effort. It's often seen as not as immediate a concern as other things on their plate. So that senior support was really critical for us.
Okay. One more question, Gabe. Martin asked, any advice on how to get upper management and staff to buy into a similar program?
So for us, I mentioned that informal socialization process. So we had some one-on-one conversations with more than one of those executives before that official pitch. So they had a chance to weigh in, and we got a sense of who might be supportive and who might have some skepticism about that process, and we were able to fold in some rebuttals to those doubts into our business case presentation to the executive committee. So I think a little bit of extra legwork on the front end can make sure that you've got a little bit smoother process once you end up at the formal decision point. At least that was our experience.
Okay. Why don't we answer one more question, Gabe, from Laurie. Are the workshops voluntary or mandatory, and what kind of participation do you get?
So let me come back to those. We have the graphic in here about the two approaches. So for the management-driven process, there really is no opt-out. So if the executive or the senior leader in a given area has identified your position as at risk, the first communication is from that person's supervisor, not from one of us, saying, hey, this is coming. We'd like you to participate. Here's why it's important. We have a little template we provide in terms of what that communication can look like. Oftentimes, though, we're recommending that communication be face-to-face, so you have a chance to dialogue as opposed to just announce something to that individual. In terms of the workshops, though, that is meant to be voluntary. So it's come one, come all. Show up if either you have some sort of tacit knowledge that you'd like captured, or if you know someone who is in that position, and this could be a supervisor in a given work group, it could be a lead or a principal in a given work group who's kind of a lieutenant, if you will, for the supervisor. So that group or those workshops end up being pretty interesting cross-section of the organization, but that's meant to be more of the pull approach as opposed to the push, which is the management-driven approach.
Okay.
Was that all the questions for now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, in that case, we'll continue on and talk a little bit more in detail about the toolkit itself. I mentioned earlier those 3 phases. Phase 1, identifying whose knowledge we should capture. So we'll talk more about that. So this is our knowledge loss risk assessment. And this tool, again, it usually isn't terribly time consuming. The shortest I've seen this go is about 15 minutes. The longest is about 20 to 30, depending on the size of the group. We're having them initially think about individuals that might have risk of leaving their role with some sort of critical or unique knowledge or skill. So it's a template. It's actually an Excel template. When we meet with these senior leaders, we actually hand out a hard copy since we found it's better to collect that data right then and there rather than wait for that. So we ask them to think about those individuals and then assign a rating. So one is we call it position risk, and that's looking at just how unique and how critical is that person's knowledge. And then a second rating, we call it a departure risk, and that is what's the immediacy of the risk of them leaving that role. So let me define those a little bit more. So position risk, I'll give you a couple examples of that. We have about 130, 140 line customer service reps in our call center. So these individuals, these are entry-level jobs for the most part. They are hourly positions. The work they do is very structured, so there's a standard operating procedure for everything and anything that they do. There's scripts, there's questions to ask, there's program information. They go through an intensive, I think it's 5-week training process. So we can take someone off the street, if you will. If they've got good customer service skills, we can turn them into a real quality frontline CSR in our call center through that training process, and they've got lots of performance support on the job, searchable knowledge bases, you name it. So that's the type of job that's probably going to get a lower position risk rating, given that it's entry level, given that you've got lots of knowledge shared by that group of 130, 140 some odd people. Some other positions, I'll give you one example of a 5. We were working with a particular area, and the individual that showed up with a high total risk factor was not only going to retire within the next 4 to 6 months, so I gave them a high departure risk of I think it was a 5, but also the position risk was quite high because that particular SME was a singular process owner. There was no one else that was their kind of right-hand person in terms of really understanding their process the way they did. They actually invented the program and process themselves. They also then wrote a proprietary SQL database software unique to us that was around our energy trading and contracts business. This was a SME's SME, go-to person, and their process was responsible for both SMUD receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year related to their process and also writing checks worth millions. So that was an easy 5 on the position risk because of the criticality of their work and their process and the fact that, again, there was very little documentation at that time, so it was a very high position risk for us. So that person's total risk factor, if I recall correctly, was around a 24 or 25. So we just take those 2 numbers and multiply them in our little toolkit. So just wanted to give you a couple examples of what we mean by that. Now, departure risk can be a lot of things. One organization looked at as having several best practices was looking specifically at retirement risk as the main factor in assigning whether this person should be looked at. And we thought about that, and we figured, well, certainly that's one reason someone might leave a job, but there's lots of other reasons. So what about promotion? What about transfer? What if someone's in the bubble in terms of their performance? So we decided to expand our definition and look at any form of departure, including retirement, but not limited to that. So again, our little toolkit just multiplies those numbers and we get a total risk factor. The second element here is, what knowledge should be captured. Just because this person is expert in 10 areas does not mean that we necessarily have to focus on capturing all of that knowledge. So the second step here, we call it a knowledge skill criticality assessment. And that's really to try to figure out of everything in this person's head, what's really most at risk right now. Where we have some vulnerability, where would we potentially be at risk if this person was to either, say, win the lottery and head to the Bahamas, or maybe get hit by a bus. Some people call this bus planning. So there's lots of scenarios that could cause us to be worried about that risk. So this step, we have the subject matter expert involved, and in some cases we'll also involve their supervisor. Here we're looking at 3 different factors. One is a rating of importance for each of those areas. So the first step, we do a little bit of a brain dump, and this can be a pretty time-consuming step where we're asking them, okay, tell us about the processes you own, tell us about the reports you write, tell us about the relationships that you manage, the technology you used. And we're looking at all of those, and we're then assigning an importance. And the importance really is, what's the impact of that particular knowledge or skill? Sometimes if we didn't have it, the impact is very much localized, meaning it's contained to just that immediate department or work group. But in other cases, the impact is much bigger. It could impact an entire business unit. It can impact all of SMUD. So for us, that's a critical question to look at that particular piece of know-how that they have. What's the ripple effect of having it or missing it, especially when it's with one individual. So that's one thing we look at. Again, a good example would be something like using technology that lots of other people use. If that's the case, that would probably get a low importance, as opposed to being an expert in a very unique proprietary technology that no other organization is using. Maybe we developed in-house and we actually programmed it ourselves. That's the type of expertise that would certainly get a high rating on importance. Another quick example of that, we had some hydro asset superintendents retiring. We had 2 of them retire at the same time. Each had over 30 years of experience in that area. And for us, hydro is a very important power source. It's very efficient. It's very cost effective. In any case, one of the elements that got rated high for them on importance was some relationships with external agencies, Department of Interior, Department of Forestry, some others, that were critical to our being effective in managing agreements with those third parties. So that's another good example where it doesn't have to be a piece of technology or a thing. In some cases, it could be a relationship. The second element up there is rarity, and that's looking at just how rare is this thing. So, for example, if this is expertise that's shared by lots of folks, we'd probably give that a low rating. An example being how do you refer a customer to a program? We've got 140 folks that know how to do that. On the other side of that would be someone who knows the ins and outs of how to track the taxes associated with our ownership interest in specific strata of gas, natural gas in New Mexico, underground. So that's a pretty complex, specialized thing, and we have very few people here that are really expert in that. So that type of knowledge, because it would be so rare, we get a very high rating. The final element up there is documentation, and like many organizations, we do not have this. We don't have this in every area that we need it. It's a real, still continues to be an opportunity for us. So what we find is this is something that often either is completely missing, or maybe at some point something was documented, but it hasn't been looked at in years, so it's very out of date. So that's something we're looking at. If you have strong documentation, this gets a lower rating. For example, going back to that CSR where almost every facet of their job is scripted, or you've got a step-by-step manual for it, and it's all electronic and it's all updated, weekly, versus, which you get a low rating, versus an area where there was either no documentation today of a process, that would get a high rating here, or the other consideration for documentation is if it's really out of date, it's really not all that useful. So you could end up with a pretty high rating of maybe a 4 here if it's very outdated, it hasn't been looked at in a while. Maybe you have an SOP, standard operating procedure, a policy, a process, but nobody's looked at this thing in a very long time. So if it's very out of date, that could get a high rating. And then the final element there is looking at how difficult would it be to create documentation around that area of expertise. Some things we could come up with a checklist in about an hour. There's other things, though, that especially when they're manual processes, when there's a lot of situational variables, where the way you approach it will vary depending on the unique circumstances you're facing that day at that time. That's not easy stuff to document because you have so many situational variables. So we do consider the difficulty, the degree of difficulty to create documentation when we assign that last rating there. So before we go any further into the toolkit, this might be a good time to pause and ask some questions here. Robert, do we have any at this time?
Yeah, sure. Here we go. Raphael was asking, excuse me, for some referrals in terms of consultants. Do you have a list of consultants that can accomplish this task for our district? Recommendations would be great.
Sure. So my final slide has the name of the consulting firm we used, which is called CPS. They're a HR consulting firm that specializes in the public sector and nonprofits. So that's who we happen to use. I'm sure there's others out there. And in fact, I believe one of them was a presenter at the conference that you folks organized a little while back on strategic investment in workforce, and I forget the name off the top of my head. Robert, you probably have it closer on hand than I do, but in any case, yeah, there's certainly other entities out there. We were looking for a firm that had a long track record doing this type of thing in the public sector, because there's certainly different approaches out there in the private sector. I worked for a publicly traded telecommunications company, and there, when it came to things like succession planning, for example, we could literally tap someone on the shoulder and say, okay, well, you're next in line. If you have civil service rules that apply in your organization, you have to think a little bit differently about making sure your process is transparent and fair. So for that reason, when we tasked them with looking at knowledge chapter and workforce planning, we wanted to make sure we had an entity that had experience specifically in the public sector. So I hope that helps.
Okay. All right, one more question here. One of the pillars to an effective knowledge transfer program is a knowledge sharing network or platform which allows employees to easily access captured knowledge. Do you have such a platform? If yes, what is it called, and is it a vendor product?
So yes, I wouldn't say we're great at it yet. Something we're still working on, and I would say we're still kind of kicking the tires on the software side of it. So the two major platforms we're using for that purpose, one is our enterprise-wide intranet. We're using SharePoint as our intranet platform. And there's a lot of great things about SharePoint. One of the best things about it, and we're using 2013 now, the search capability in that system is phenomenal. So I can look for, I can do a keyword search, I can look for resources posted by a specific subject matter expert. You can add quite a bit of what's called metadata to any document, and you can search on all of that metadata. Typically what we're doing is we're asking work groups, let's say that at the outcome of this process, one of their elements on the plan is to create a process or procedures manual. we always recommend that the client then post that on the SharePoint site in one of two areas. Our default recommendation is, hey, put this out there on the global intranet where anybody in any group can find it. Unless there's some real reason for secrecy, make this thing globally searchable. The other option, if there is something that they're concerned is somehow sensitive or secret, they have the option of instead posting it on a SharePoint site with restricted permission access, in which case they can define certain work groups, certain job titles, certain levels that would have access to that information. It's still searchable, but it's only going to show up in the search results for those work groups. And a lot of our groups have department-specific SharePoint team sites. That's the secondary option. The newer technology that we're experimenting with a little bit right now is more around has kind of a social media feel to it. It's meant to be more for informal sharing of know-how, and that's a tool called Cornerstone Connect. So we use Cornerstone as our learning management system, and in that tool we have the option to create virtual communities as well as virtual teams. And what we're experimenting with now, we've got, I think, 2 or 3 groups in the pilot phase of the community side of that. And that's a tool where it kind of looks a little bit like a threaded discussion board, or they call it a feed. But it's a way to just kind of informally put out questions, get answers, post resources, and it's meant to be much less formal than the SharePoint side, where there's a lot of structure and we have some rules about how you name things, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that helps. And if you want more information on either, I'm happy to connect you to our technology gurus for both of those platforms.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from Barton. When SMUD completed the surveys of the knowledge capture toolkits, did management try to use these evaluations to reduce or eliminate employees with low importance or rarity?
So I would say that was one of the fears for some of the SMEs that were on the receiving end of the management-driven process. So if their name showed up as critical, usually it was because not only they had tacit knowledge, but this person was also a flight risk, meaning they might retire, they might be poached by another entity. We have some technical SMEs here that are in fields where there's literally national competition for some of that technical expertise. So while yes, that was a fear for some of the SMEs in terms of, gosh, why should I participate? Isn't this just an excuse to maybe put me out to pasture? Maybe just kind of capture this and then toss me aside. We worked really hard to make clear that that was not the purpose, and that really this is about leaving a strong legacy and making sure we had good processes documented, good process documentation across the board. I believe the question was also getting at, what about the lower critical positions? And just to be clear, this toolkit is around knowledge capture. We rolled out a separate toolkit at that time, or a little bit after that, on workforce planning. And none of this was used to cause layoffs or reductions in force or anything like that. Instead, all of this was about how do we make sure we have a good process in place to capture that know-how before there's a risk of it walking out the door. And on the workforce planning side, it was looking longer term at questions around, do we build or buy the talent we're going to need 1, 2, 3 years from now? And so none of this was being used to, again, eliminate positions. So that was a really important part of the messaging, and one reason why, I think I mentioned this earlier, that initial communication about what this is and why we're doing it, we typically wanted that to come from that subject matter expert's leader face-to-face. So if they had any of these types of concerns, those could be immediately put to rest.
Okay. One more question, Gabe. Victoria asks, how important is the training time of the replacement, and should it be identified?
Oh, absolutely. So if training is required for the person taking on that role, the estimating the amount of effort that's going to take is critical, and often that's a very common element to show up on these knowledge retention plans. We have a variety of different buckets of strategies. One of those buckets is around training, and we outline on our menu probably about 8 different ways you could go about training someone to take on that role. And there's some details in there that kind of help that person creating the plan with coming up with just a rough estimate for the amount of time that would require. One thing that we'd like to have more often, but we don't always have the luxury, is doing what we call a bubble hire, or you actually have the incumbent still in place when their replacement is hired. And that's, of course, ideal when you get that overlap, and that can provide a little bit more intensive training experience. But we don't always have that option. Sometimes it's the individual leaves, and then we get the ability to backfill. So that's critical, and we do our best to estimate the level of effort and provide a realistic expectation for the person doing the replacing about, hey, if you onboard this individual, you've got to build this time into their onboarding plan. I'm thinking of an example about probably a year and a half ago. We were called in by a supervisor that knew this individual was a flight risk in terms of them transferring to another department. And the supervisor was worried because they knew this person was the go-to SME around the several processes that their group was responsible for. And the impact was huge because if this person didn't do their job well, literally our line crews would not have enough poles and wire and other bolts, things they needed to get their job done. So in terms of the whole supply chain leading up to our maintenance and operations, this person had a really critical role. So one of the outcomes of that process, we did a process mapping with that individual, and it's always fun to do that because our first question is always, tell us a little bit about what you do. And inevitably one of the first things we hear is, oh, it's quite simple. And then as you ask all your follow-up questions, you find out, wow, this person has 8 different processes they're responsible for, but they don't think of it in those terms. They're just thinking about it in terms of, oh, I just go to work and I do my thing. So that process mapping was a critical step. The other outcome from working with that particular SME was I'm trying to think of the time frame. I think it was a 60-day onboarding plan. And so what happened is the individual who was going to be leading that work group shortly was putting together a really detailed, helping us put together a really detailed onboarding and training plan for their future successors. And they ended up hiring, I believe it was 2 individuals that were going to be backfilling a longer-term vacancy as well as this newer vacancy. And so that standard operating procedure manual that came out of that, the onboarding plan and training plan came out of that, that was all really helpful for that supervisor of the work group to then have a really smooth transition as that key subject matter expert exited their department. So I hope that helps.
Okay. All right. That's all the questions for now.
Okay. All right. So we were talking about step number 2 a moment ago. We walked through importance, rarity, and how much, if any, documentation is there today. And I don't want to make it sound as if we've got that figured out. We oftentimes find high-risk areas because there's little, if any, documentation, or what we have is very outdated. So the final step here is step 3, and that is what's your plan? So we call ours a knowledge retention plan. And one of the assumptions behind that plan is some knowledge that, if nothing else, you just want to document it and put it somewhere. There's other knowledge that has got to be transferred to other people in the work group, maybe to their successor. So some of this knowledge, we want to be intentional on this plan to think about what are things that just need to be archived so that if and when there's a question 6, 12, 18 months from now, we have a resource we can go back to and capture maybe some historical bit of information as opposed to knowledge or skill that's critical to transfer to others. So that's our framework we're using when we go into this step. The other thing we have folks think about is not biting off more than they can chew. We early on had some very robust plans put together, but it would have taken 2-3 years to execute them. So we are now much more careful to kind of caution our clients about putting together a very realistic plan, and we're coaching them through this process that is doable and that's prioritized. So typically what you're doing is you're starting the plan with the most critical knowledge or skill elements that you've already identified in step 2. So there's a place on this template to actually literally bring over not just the knowledge or skill description, but also the rating that it got. And the plan is typically rank ordered from highest to lowest, and we're not bringing over everything. It's kind of the rule of thumb that we've had in place for some time is at least bring over your very top items. So let's say we had 3 ratings of 5, so your maximum is 125. So let's say you've got 5 items that rank somewhere in the range of 100 to 125 in step 2. You definitely want to bring all 5 of those over to your plan. And then the question is, well, what do we do with everything else? So we have them color code and identify a cutoff point for the next groupings. We call those, B level or second priority items, and we'll color code those different color, and we'll selectively bring those over, again, rank ordered from the plan after we flesh out strategies for the top ones. So again, all of this is there to make sure that we're focusing on the most important pieces first, and we're making sure at the end of the day this is a plan that's actually implementable and we're not biting off more than we can chew. We always have to think about availability, limited resources, the fact that everyone has their day job they have to attend to in addition to this knowledge capture stuff. So we can't expect that they'll drop everything and devote full-time their energy and effort to knowledge capture. That just simply isn't realistic, especially in these operational environments that are focused on keeping our grid up and running just day to day, minute to minute. So step 3, we create this plan. We're identifying who's going to do what by when, and we have a column to capture the current status. And this plan is owned by the client. It's not owned by us. So it's their job to own and manage and keep up to date this plan. So we typically involve the subject matter expert who has a very good grasp of the, what can be done and by when and who to involve, as well as their supervisor here. So at the end of the day, this is signed off on by both the SME and their boss. So if the SME says, well, Frank would be a great person to learn this, and it'll take him 3 months, devoting 20 hours a week, and we'll be good, the supervisor is going to be in a position to say, well, there's no way we can free up Frank for 20 hours a week for 3 months. We could have him devote, say, 3 to 5 hours a week and maybe stretch that out longer if possible, or find other strategies. By the way, why is it only Frank and not Frank and, Tina and all the other folks that might be trained up on this? So that's a really important role. The supervisor is there to give perspective, to give a bit of a reality check on what might be a little bit of an optimistic plan, a first draft plan. So there's typically several iterations of these. The SME might create the first draft, but it's not final until their boss, in some cases their boss's boss as well, has a chance to weigh in on that. There's another important element here where there are times when the leader has a different perspective in terms of who should be sharing what. So maybe there's 3 ways of doing something, and the person we're working with has one way of doing it, but the boss has a perspective that, I'm not sure I want everyone doing it that way. So then they have a chance here to weigh in and say, okay, I'm going to provide some input in terms of who our best practice leaders are in that given area, whatever the issue is or the skill is. So that's another critical role that the supervisor has. So In some cases, I'm meeting with them one-on-one to look it over. The SME is usually sending them a first draft, and at the end of the day, it's not final until their boss has had a chance to weigh in and that.
We got about 5 minutes left, Gabe, just to let you know.
Okay. All right. So in those 5 minutes here, we probably won't have time to cover everything on the screen, but I wanted to at least put it up here. So this knowledge retention plan template, again, there's a column for the what, there's a column for who, there's a column for when, and there's a column for the status. So very simple template there. We have built out a pretty comprehensive set of strategies there, and I just wanted to share some examples with you. I'm hoping that you can see my Excel document I'm sharing with you right now. So when thinking about what we can do to capture and transfer knowledge, there's so many options. And what you're seeing at the very bottom of the screen are some of the categories that we've come up with to help facilitate this process. One of the there's a group of actions that really belong to the supervisor or manager, and those are around identifying and developing replacements. It could also be, can we change the nature of the work, whether it's process automation or new technology or changing who's responsible for what, that would reduce or maybe even eliminate the need for that knowledge or skill. If you have new equipment coming in that will completely replace the old equipment, maybe we don't have to capture that existing know-how on that piece of equipment. So there's inevitably some parts of the plan that are owned by the supervisor of that SME who's at risk of leaving. There's also a group of actions here specific for the incumbent in the job, and inevitably we'll find there's a lack of documentation. So we have some resources that we share around how do you create a process map, and we have a little kind of job aid to help them with that. If you were to create initially just a mind map, how would you do that? We have some YouTube videos we link out to help them with that. What if it's just a simple checklist? Could that help? Sometimes it doesn't have to be fancy. It could be a 1 or 2 page checklist. So we give them options in terms of how you might go about documenting. In some cases, seeing is believing, so we have an option there for that SME to be followed by a digital video camera, and so we have that ready to go for those cases. In other cases, they'd rather talk about it than write it. So we have used a digital voice recorder in some cases to simply talk to and interview those individuals or have them walk us through their process. Roundtables, they're getting together other experts in that area to talk about and share expertise. We have a interview template with about 30, 40 questions that we can ask to tease out, okay, what's the best way of doing this? What are some lessons learned? What have you had to learn the hard way? What are the many hats you wear? Tell us about the project that was difficult and what you learned from it. Talk to us about vendors, how do you select them, hiring, project management. So there's quite a few different categories there. In some cases, the incumbent needs to train their peers or mentor. Oftentimes, they're in a good position to help their boss select their replacement or replacements. So there's some prompts in there to think about interview questions and testing. And then finally, when it comes to learners, we typically want a group of folks involved as opposed to just one who's pre-selected, since that brings up all kinds of civil service issues. So who can we get involved early, maybe in OJT or classroom training, or maybe do a skills assessment with that group of 2, 3, 5 people that have an interest. So I wanted to share a little bit about that with you. So I believe we're just about out of time. So at this point, let me do this. I'll just turn the floor back over to Robert. We'll do our wrap-up, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Okay. All right. Well, I know there are a few more questions in the queue, but unfortunately we are out of time. We apologize again for the technical difficulties and getting a late start and keeping you a little later than we had planned. But this valuable information that we covered today, we will try to get all your questions answered via email in a few days. I want to thank Gabe for presenting such great information and sharing his vast knowledge with us. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We want all of you to know that Gabe will be hosting a live 2-hour session on this very topic on November 17th at our training buffet which will be held in Oakland in East Bay Mud's downtown building. If you attend the training buffet last year, you know it was a great event. We will be sending out more information on it as November approaches. Also, please know that the recording of this workshop will be posted at baywork.org within the next 2 weeks, and also the full PowerPoint presentation will be posted as well. Additionally, we will mail contact hour certificates to those who answered yes to the questions regarding them on the registration form. And lastly, we really want to know your thoughts about this webinar. Please take a moment to complete the survey you will receive immediately after we are done. It's only 3 questions. So Gabe, do you have any final words?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully my contact information is showing on the screen. I'm happy to talk to folks further. Again, appreciate the opportunity to share.
All right. Well, we appreciate you joining us today. And on behalf of Baywork, thanks again, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Goodbye.